All right, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. For those of you that'll be looking for AI continuing education credits, the learning units are shown here. And with that, I will hand it off to Ed.
Well, good morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm Ed Mazria, founder and CEO of Architecture 2030. I'd like to welcome you all to the 1.5 degree C Global Teach-In. Today, we will set the budgets for 1.5, the timeline, and the actions we in the built environment must take to meet those targets. The session today will focus on planning, architecture, construction, and the tools and policies available that will effectively reduce emissions to keep planetary warming to under the 1.5 degrees C. So let's get started. Right now, as you all know, and many of us are feeling here in the US, we're in a climate emergency. And the problem and the issue, as we all know, also is fossil fuels. Timing is everything at this point. We've all heard about carbon budgets and staying under the 1.5, but many people don't really understand what that means. Right now, in order to meet the 1.5 degrees C target, our carbon budget is 340 gigatons of CO2. That gives us a high probability of meeting the 1.5 degrees C target. Let's see what that means. Today, we emit roughly 40 gigatons of CO2. That's global. That's how much we emit roughly every year. It goes up and down. This year will probably be a little less, but it's expected to go back up to about 40. If we take a straight line, if we peak emissions in 2020 and we take a straight line all the way down to phasing out all CO2 emissions by 2050, that's 600 gigatons of CO2. That gives us less than a 50% chance of meeting the 1.5. That's almost double the budget we have left to meet the 1.5 degrees C. So what do we need to do to meet the 1.5? Well, we need to reduce emissions roughly 65% between now and 2030, and then completely phase out fossil fuel CO2 emissions by the year 2040. Why is that so important? Well, of all the scenarios that the IPCC has run, once you go past the 2 degrees C, once we go past that budget, climate change becomes pretty much irreversible. Only by staying under the 1.5 are we able to begin to bring the planet back to the kind of temperatures that we've always known. So, a few facts. By 2060, world urban population is expected to increase by about 2.75 billion people. That's equal to the entire population growth estimate. So most of the growth is expected to take place in and around cities worldwide. To put that in perspective, every week, about 1.5 million people are expected to be added to cities worldwide. So where's all this going to happen? Where's all the construction expected to take place to house all these people? Well, right now we're in a pandemic. Many economies are shut down. But once we come out of the pandemic, it's really the global north where we'll see quite a bit of infrastructure, money put, and quite a bit of construction take place. So initially, we will see quite a bit of construction in the global north, North America, Europe, China. China's is beginning to build back now. Once that happens, about 8 to 10 years out, we expect to see construction move toward the global south. And then after that, we expect to see an explosion because of population growth in the global south. So that's where most of the construction will take place after the first 10 years. So it's critical, since we're constructing, expected to construct now, that we get it right, so that we at least set the agenda for the rest of the world to build out. Now, why is that explosion in the global south so important? Take a look at where all the forests are. The tropical forests are in that band in the global south. And we're losing a huge amount of forest every minute. About 36 football fields worth of forests are being taken down. And deforestation is now responsible for about 8 to 10% of all global emissions on an annual basis. Why that's so critical is look where all the biodiversity is in the world, where the highest density of vertebrate species are. And you can see it's essentially in that same band in the global south. On average, the global population of mammals, birds, fish, reptiles is already down 68%, went down 68% between 1970 and 2016. So we've lost a huge number of species, and we can't afford to lose any more. So we need to essentially stop deforestation in this region. And that's where the explosion of construction is expected to take place in the near future. So how do we achieve a carbon positive built environment to meet the 1.5? Well, it's essentially a two-step process. Step one is planning, design, and construction. It's what we do every single day, and electrification. And then step two is the renewables to supply the energy. Planning, design, and construction can get us 70 to 80% of the way there at no cost or low cost. It's really making the correct design and planning decisions and construction decisions, and electrifying our buildings and not using on-site fossil fuels, especially as we design these buildings out. And then to use renewables to pick up the rest. So design and planning decisions, that's everything from growth boundaries, building compact communities, transportation, walkable communities, urban agriculture, moving agriculture out from the countryside back in to the urban areas, so we're not taking up all of that land. Designing our buildings, passive heating and cooling systems that are just good design decisions, and then how we construct our buildings and what materials we use, and beginning to use carbon positive materials that actually sequester carbon, as long as we do it in the right way. And that's the no cost, low cost. Step two are the renewables. Buildings are going to use energy, and making materials are going to use energy. And so that energy needs to come from renewables, either on-site or utility scale renewables, everything from solar, wind to hydro. That's the plan. That's how we get there. And if you go to 2030palette.org, there are lots of recommendations for how to do that. Everything from how you lay out cities and districts and sites to building materials. And as we learn more from this teaching, we will be updating the 2030 palette and adding in quite a bit of new information. Now, we've all heard that that density may be a risk factor in the spread of this pandemic that we're all right in the middle of now. So we looked at density to see that. The density is sort of getting a bad name, but a new study just came out of 913 counties in the United States, and it indicates that density is not an infection risk factor. In fact, what they found was that in suburban and rural areas, there was a much higher death rate than in the urban cores because of less access to healthcare and medical facilities. We've conducted our own study of density and cities all across the world. And you can see two of the largest cities, New York City, for example, and Seoul. Seoul is slightly larger, has much higher density. And if you look at the death rates, density doesn't play a part in this. You could look at Berlin, San Francisco, Chicago, and you see that density is not really the risk factor. So how do we reset to meet the 1.5 degrees C carbon budget? What do we need to begin to do? Well, the built environment emissions come from three areas. One is new buildings. We call that building operations. The other is existing buildings. And again, those are operating these existing buildings, all the energy it takes and the emissions that come from that. And then the materials, construction, and infrastructure, the embodied carbon to build all the develop all the materials to build all this construction. So let's look at new buildings and building operations. How do we get that under control? Well, all new buildings from today on, essentially, need to begin to come in at zero carbon. They don't use any carbon. And we have the tools to do that. We have zero codes. We now have an international zero code standard that essentially is design a fairly efficient building and then use on-site or off-site renewables, and you get that building to zero carbon. That's all online at zerocode.org. It's essentially an efficiency standard and then electrification and renewables to supply that electricity. That's how you get to zero carbon. Why is that so important? Well, we saw where that explosion is going to happen of construction, roughly 10 years out, and you see that there are very, very few codes and not very good codes in that area. So in the global north, we need to get the zero code in place right away, and then begin to get an uptake in all the essentially throughout the rest of the world. So what is a zero code? As I said, you design an efficient building. You can use any contemporary code standard. They will all get you a fairly efficient building. Once you have an efficient building, you put in the passive heating systems, cooling systems, let sunlight in the building in cold climates, shade it in warm climates. Then you can address the rest of the remaining needs of the energy for those buildings with on-site renewables. And if you can't do it on-site, then you can always buy off-site renewable energy. So that's the zero code. The zero code is now an International Energy Conservation Code standard. So any city or jurisdiction can adopt it. China just developed their own nearly zero energy plus on-site and off-site renewables standard. They need to get that out. The cities in China need to adopt it. And the European Commission with the directive is calling for all countries to have a nearly zero energy building plus on-site and nearby off-site renewables in place beginning next year. So it's happening. We know how to do it. The tools are available. The codes are available. We need to get moving to adopt it worldwide. Second is existing buildings. How do we address all the existing buildings in the world today using all this energy? We have to bring that obviously to 65% and down to zero. Well, if we look at cities worldwide, we see a familiar pattern. You see the large buildings in that small area in Seattle, for example, then surrounded by much, much smaller buildings. Well, that small group of buildings in that area to the right of the screen, middle right, is responsible for about half of all Seattle's emissions. So there are big emitters, and there are very few of them, and we can get a handle on that, and then we can deal with all the rest. So that's one way to do it. And if we look at cities all over, we see this is New York City. About half the emissions come from just these buildings in this area in Midtown, Lower Manhattan, and downtown Brooklyn. We can see the same thing in Chicago along the waterfront. the large kind of mountain of buildings, and then surrounded by lots of small buildings. Those buildings are responsible for almost half of all of Chicago's emissions. Same thing in Los Angeles. You can see the same thing in Spain, in Riyadh, in Lagos, and all the way out. If we look at Ho Chi Minh City, you also see these very large structures, buildings that are using a huge amount of energy, responsible for quite a bit of emissions. So very few buildings and areas in a city are responsible for a huge portion of emissions. So how do we develop policies for all these existing buildings, for those few large emitters, and then for all the other emitters? Well, the first thing we need to understand is intervention points. That if a building is undergoing an upgrade, is going to actually get renovated, or they're going to change out equipment, it costs 75% less, almost very, very little, to upgrade it to the most efficient systems out there. So we want to look for those intervention points when we're requiring buildings to make upgrades, because then it's fairly inexpensive. So we have two building types, the large building emitters that we talked about, and then all the other buildings. So for the large building emitters, we say, since there are so few of them in a city, and they're responsible for a huge portion of a city's emissions, we say that they need to get to zero carbon by 2030. They need to be electrified, all electric, and use renewable energy for that electricity, either on-site and off-site. That gives them 10 years to hit a capital improvement cycle and to make those adjustments. And so we don't get everyone piling up at 2030 trying to meet a directive. We should provide incentives for them to go early, give them low interest loans, tax abatements that if they do it right away, rebates, and then phase those out as you get closer to 2030. So you need, for the large emitters, you need a date certain where they have to get to zero carbon. For all the other buildings, you look at intervention points and then require the same thing, zero carbon. If you come in for a zoning or use change, point of renovation, if you're going to renovate, if you're going to replace equipment, you require the most efficient equipment and electrification. Or if you're going to sell a building, the new owners come in, they have the financing in place, you require them to do the same, and you provide, again, incentives for many of these buildings to go early. So that's existing big building policies. What about materials, construction, and infrastructure to build out this huge amount of construction that's expected to take place? Well, we haven't really dealt with that issue because there are literally hundreds of thousands of materials to choose from when constructing a building. Everything from wood, steel, concrete, brick, to gypsum board, tile, lighting systems, HVAC, different kinds of metals, you name it. So how do we get a handle on this? Well, this is the way we have basically seen how emissions are apportioned, emissions and energy consumption. Building operations responsible for about 28% of all emissions. And then we have industry. In industry, we have it divided into two parts. One is building construction, is essentially core and shell. That's all the steel, cement, bricks, glass, roofing. The entire core and shell of a building is responsible for about 11%. And then everything else falls into that 32%. Infrastructure, HVAC, lighting, equipment, interiors, carpet, site work, all that falls into 32%. So when you start to think about this, it becomes almost daunting. How are we going to get a handle on all of this? So we took a shot at reshaping the pie, and boy, we came up with something really interesting. Just two materials, concrete and steel, are responsible for half of all industrial emissions, just two materials. So if we get a handle on that, just like the big emitters and all the thousands and hundreds of thousands of small emitters, if we get a handle on those two, we can address half of the pie right away. So concrete and steel really, and then aluminum are the big emitters, and that we can get a handle on while we're figuring out all the rest and reducing emissions and all the rest of the industrial sector. So how do we do that? Well, the first thing is we have to change the conversation. Everyone needs to understand where those emissions are coming from and what do we need to do for that to happen. How do we do that? Well, we are changing the conversation. It started about a year ago, and now in mainstream media, we're seeing things like in The Guardian, concrete, the most destructive material on the planet, in Bloomberg, steelmakers, next in the crosshair. So everyone is now beginning to understand that these two materials are really high emitters. And we're also seeing alternatives. Mass timber is also becoming a material that is giving them competition. And architects are beginning to talk about it. If it comes from responsibly managed forests, then it could be a carbon positive material, actually sequester carbon. So we're beginning to see all of this take place in the embodied carbon arena in the past year and a half, which is good news. So we all know what the issues are. So what do we do? Well, there are three things that we can do as gatekeepers of the built environment. We can reuse, reduce, and sequester. So what do we mean by reuse? Well, reuse is a planning, design, specifications, and policy issue. And that is everything from repurposing, rather than tearing down, repurposing urban areas, renovating them, reusing existing buildings. We're going to see quite a bit of that because of the pandemic, and buildings have to be renovated to kind of address this new world we're living in. That all saves on steel, concrete, and all sorts of building materials. And we can also design our buildings to be deconstructed or reuse a lot of materials when we take down a building, rather than put it in a landfill. So that's what we mean by reuse. Reduce is also, again, a planning, design, specifications, and policy issue. And by planning, we mean everything from growth boundaries, compact communities, infill, and density. So we're not taking up all this land, optimizing structure. So we're not overusing materials, specifying low carbon or zero carbon or carbon positive materials. We're calling for a minimum 40% reduction in the carbon of any material that's specified, and then policies to basically move low carbon materials out into the marketplace. And sequestering, what we talk about in sequestering is carbon sequestering materials and landscapes. And that's everything from, we talked about wood, glue laminated wood, bamboo now is very fast growing material and can be cross-laminated and made into structural units. You'll hear more about that in sessions to follow. Carbon positive aggregate, actually making aggregate out of CO2 and sequestering it and changing its properties. Injecting CO2 into concrete, using biomaterials that actually sequester carbon, and how we deal with landscapes and soil and urban agriculture is also a carbon positive and sequestering planning and design issue. And we'll talk more about that also in sessions to follow. Very exciting area that we're beginning to learn more about. So the question becomes, can we meet the 1.5, this very, this 65% and then zero by 2040, the 340 gigaton carbon budget? Can we meet it? Well, this was Toronto in 1891, a photograph. You see in the left-hand side what's called a Flatiron building. Keep your eye on that building with the little tower on top. So this is 1891. This is what Toronto looks like today. That's the only building left from 1891. The Flatiron Building is there, but look at what has happened in Toronto. How did that all take place? We can see that same scenario in London, in Addis Ababa, in Johannesburg. We can see the same pattern has taken place all over the world. So how did that all happen? Let's look at roughly 1925. In 1925, what's considered the first modern building was the Bauhaus in Germany. Structure moved inside the building. You see the concrete, and then the walls were hung on the building. So you had point loads, and you can open up the interior space and have lots of glass and view out. And then fossil fuels were cheap, almost cost nothing at that time. And so you can put heaters in and condition space. That was in 1925. That's the first modern building. What was going on at that time in 1925? Well, in 25, we had the first Model T truck. Things were pretty primitive back then. You didn't even have television. We had something called radio vision, where we sent radio waves and saw an image. And then we made the first transatlantic call in 1927. So that was roughly around that time. Conditions were really pretty bad during that time. So a group of international architects and planners got together and held the first International Congress of Modern Architecture and set out architecture and planning principles, essentially to take care of what was going on. We had industry and housing all together, and emphysema and all sorts of things going on. Pandemics were happening back then, but conditions were really pretty bad. So they laid out the principles in this Congress, and Le Corbusier laid out his 5 points of architecture, which was essentially moving structure inside the building so that you can essentially hang the wall and have lots of glass and light coming into buildings. You'd free up the design of the wall plan. So CIAM, that happened in 1928. By 32, we had an what was called the international style. We can now design essentially the same building anywhere, glass and light and everything, and move structure inside. And we now had an international style because we could climate control buildings anywhere in the world. What was going on at that time is that was the first commercial airport, for example, in the US. Took place in 35. By 39, we had the Johnson Wax building. And then by the 40s and 49, we had Philip Johnson's glass house. This was a single glass building in a very cold climate because we can climate control buildings. By 52, the world had changed. We had the Lever House, we had skyscrapers, structure moved inside, and we were hanging single glass curtain walls everywhere because we could, again, we had fossil fuels, they were cheap, we can climate control everything. By 56, we actually had an entire master plan based on the modern principles of planning. So there you have it. We did all that in 27 years. From 1925 to roughly 1952, the world changed. And we changed. And we did it with primitive tools, T-square, triangle, an ink bottle with a pen that you had to dip in. If you made a mistake on your drawings, you had to scrape the ink off. We couldn't design curves. We had a slide rule for structures. We didn't get the first ink pen until 1960, and we didn't get the first laptop until way after that, 1991. So we changed the world in 27 years with just those tools. What are the tools we have today? Well, we can model any building, the daylighting, the heating, the cooling of any building, see all the energy consumption. We can do all that. We can structure anything now, and we can build anything now. And we can actually upload entire cities and see how much sunlight falls on every single surface in a building and calculate all of this. And we have all these incredible tools that have just recently come out. Some of them are older, but many of them are brand new and that you probably haven't even heard of. And we'll have tool demonstrations throughout the day. So how do we meet this 340 gigatons? Well, we have to call for no new, but we need a moratorium on coal and gas plants and no more gas hookups into buildings. That needs to stop immediately. And then we need to get the zero code out there and design the zero carbon buildings. It's not that difficult. If we do that, we peak emissions and we begin on the downslide. And then by 2030, we need to phase out all coal plants worldwide. That has to be a given. And then we need to look to electrify about 50% of our floor area and get a 50% reduction at least in steel and concrete emissions by 2030. We have a good 10 years to do that. Not impossible at all. Very, very doable. If we just do those things, we get a 54.3% reduction. That's not even dealing with transportation and all sorts of other materials and issues. So it's all very, very doable. So can we meet the 1.5 degrees C carbon budget? Of course we can. Let me pose this to you. This is the amount of energy that falls on each square foot of surface in a year in 4 different cities. So we looked at Berlin in the way north, 52 degrees north latitude, New York, 40 degrees north latitude, coming down a bit, Cairo at 30, getting more down toward the equator, and then Johannesburg on the other, essentially the other side, the south side of the planet at 26 degrees south. This is how much sunlight in BTUs a square foot or a square meter. How much sunlight falls on that square foot or square meter every year. That's how much sunlight falls. That's distributed to those cities. This is how much falls on the south face, in Johannesburg it'd be north face of a building, for example, or a surface, each square foot or square meter. And this is how much falls on the east and west side. So that's how much energy, actual energy, is distributed free to every single square foot or square meter of site in a year, as long as it's not shaded. This is if you use not even the latest code standard. This is the 2016 ASHRAE standard for buildings, for an office and a school. This is how much energy it needs to operate a square foot of building all year. So square foot or square meter of building, square foot, square meter, to square foot, square meter. So apples to apples. That's how much energy you need on the right. That's how much you get distributed free to every site in the world, essentially. The worst case being, for example, in this case, way, way north in Berlin. So that's what Berlin looks like. That's how much energy you receive on those surfaces in Berlin, free, distributed. And that's how much energy, and this is not even up to speed with the European building codes, which are even more stringent. So those little red bars would be even less. That's how much energy you need. All you need to do is capture it, store some of it for use at night, and you have a carbon neutral building. And this is not rocket science. We're sending spacecraft to Saturn, for example, and sending it through the rings of Saturn, sending back data. We can do all that. And you mean to tell me that we can't solve this problem? That's the energy we get free to every site and every surface on a building throughout the world. And that's the worst case. And we can't solve this problem? Of course we can solve the problem. We just haven't put any resources to it. And look where all the sunlight is falling. It's right in that area where all the construction is going to take place. This is the most energy-rich area in the world with high concentrations of solar energy. All they need is some financing, and getting to zero is incredibly doable. So what do? Well, we need to commit and we need to take the actions. And you can go to We have on our website a commitment. The commitment essentially consists of all new buildings zero carbon, electrify existing buildings, adopt zero codes, and then get to a 40% reduction in embodied carbon by 2021, zero steel and concrete, zero carbon steel and concrete by 2030, and then zero carbon for all other materials by 2040. CarbonPositive.org. We will hopefully see you in Glasgow. We'll hold a summit just before the COP26 in October, and we'll bring back together all the people that are doing great work that have attended the teaching. It really is up to us. With that, I would like to introduce you to my colleague, Farhana Yamin. Farhana is an environmental lawyer. She was lead author of 3 IPCC assessments. She was key in getting the countries at COP21 in Paris to agree to limit planetary warming to 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. She's going to talk to us about that now and the importance of the upcoming COP26 in Glasgow next year.
Thank you, Ed. Good morning, everyone who's joined today. Yeah, my name's Farhana Yamin. I've been a climate change lawyer and an advisor to the small island states in the UN climate negotiations since 1991. So I started as a young professional, as a newly married young woman. I'm now 55. My daughter, who was born just before the first UN COP, that's the Conference of the Parties, the big UN summits that we have every year, is now 25. She will turn 26 next week, actually. So for me, these annual COPs that we have, these annual summits, are also a reminder to me as a mother and as a professional who took part in all of these negotiations, spent sometimes months and weeks away from home, how significant they are and how many people have worked towards them and how much progress has been made, but also how much progress remains to be made. And I'm feeling, you know, sometimes quite optimistic and hopeful, especially when I've heard Ed, and I know that the energy landscape has changed over the 30 years that I've been active in climate change. We have now a landscape which looks very different. Energy costs, you know, of the renewables, battery storage, solar have just become smaller and smaller and smaller and are way more competitive. They're cheaper than the fossil fuel alternatives. They're cheaper than anything else if we were to take into account all of the pollution actually that is part and parcel of fossil fuel. So there isn't an even playing field, but already in most parts of the world, these technologies, renewable technologies, are much cheaper. So I want to say a few words about why the COP and why the 1.5 target is so significant. Essentially, from the 4th IPCC assessment report, that's not the one that we just had before Paris, was the 5th one. The 4th one came out around 2007, and in it contained a huge amount of science which showed that even at much lower temperatures than 2 degrees, there would be huge amounts of devastation. My client countries, the small island and vulnerable countries, were obviously the front lines of those devastating impacts, and they chose to act on the science and to press from 2007, 2008 onwards for the inclusion of the 1.5 goal as the overarching way in which we would avoid dangerous climate change. So there was a massive discussion about what the new international framework would look like, how we would replace the Kyoto Protocol with what became the Paris Agreement, which is the the overarching international agreement that we agreed in 2015 in the end. But actually, we were meant to agree that Paris back in 2009 at a summit called COP15, and in 2009 we were supposed to have adopted the global treaty. And I'm talking about that now because I want everyone here to be really aware that the 1.5 goal isn't new, and it's been called impossible, or people have been saying it's too expensive and not achievable for about 10, 12 years. And that is the decade which we have lost and which we have to make good now. That's what we have to catch up with. So there's a sort of mentality of a can't do, no, this is too difficult, let's just go for 2 degrees. Well, that's a mentality which has been deliberately inculcated and propagated, and people have accepted that it's somehow okay to allow the most vulnerable countries, the most vulnerable communities to bear the impacts, and that somehow those impacts are going to happen over there. They're not going to happen to us in the richer countries, in the developed countries, in the global north. And actually what we're now seeing is, as the scientists said, these impacts are not just going to impact poorer people or just frontline communities. Impacts are going to affect all of the climate, all of the ecosystems, and all of the world. We're already at 1.1 degree global temperature rise since the industrial age as of today. So we're not far off from crossing very dangerous climatic boundaries, and in some ways we may have already triggered them, but that doesn't mean that we stop and sort of give up in despair. We have to continue to try and reduce global warming as much as possible, and to keep the 1.5 and the well below 2 degrees targets well in sight. So the significance of the COP in Glasgow, which was, as you know, meant to happen this year, was meant to happen in November of this year, is that it was the 5-year ratchet of ambition, the 5-year periodic resubmission of what are called NDCs, nationally determined contributions, essentially each government's, each country's national plan for their targets and pathways to keeping to the Paris temperature goals. So at Paris itself, countries tabled their first round of NDCs, their national plans, and those were highly inadequate. They added up in aggregate, they would have reduced emissions to about 2.7 degrees. So even back in 2015, when we had the signing of the Paris Agreement, the national targets that countries put forward were not in line with science. They were highly disappointing, and there was an agreement that the countries would review and resubmit and upgrade their national plans and come back with more ambitious targets every 5 years. So we're at that 5-year moment, and this is why 2020 is so significant. And countries are now preparing those revised plans. Sadly, even before COVID struck, even before we had a global recession, which is probably going to be the largest, deepest in world history, we had fewer countries, even before these things struck, who were signing up to more ambitious targets. We had only, I think back in August, 8 countries that had submitted these revised plans. We had none of the major richer countries developing, we had none of the major richer countries, the US, the EU, China and others, submitting these plans. They are now saying that they will submit them. Intensive negotiations are going on between the EU and China. These are the biggest blocs that are going to submit revised NDCs. The EU announced yesterday that it would be revising its NDC to have a 55% reduction by 2030. which is a raise in ambition from the 40%, but it is nowhere near the 65% that should align with a 1.5 degree goal, and should align with the way in which the accounting works, actually, with the use of offsets and land use emissions. It's a much smaller raise in ambition than we were hoping for, but it's nevertheless an improvement. So there is, you know, the COP26 process is forcing countries to come up with their revised national plans. We're hoping that China also undertakes a revision and puts in a far more ambitious NDC than it has tabled, despite the fact that the US is withdrawing from the Paris Agreement on 4th of November. That's irrespective of what happens in the US elections, but a lot rests on what happens in Europe and China, and in what happens on the ground in the US, whatever happens in your elections. I want to just emphasize that, you know, right now, the doability of 1.5 has never been better. And it rests really on all of us as professionals in our own jobs, in our own sectors, to start making the necessary changes, to insisting sometimes to clients, even when clients may be, you know, going for a suboptimal solution or may not know what's at stake, for us to actually educate them and to insist that they make better choices, and that each of us use our creativity and imagination, and use the power of the professions that we have, the simple tools that, you know, Ed has said, to encourage everyone to go on the 1.5 path, and not to say, oh, it's too late, I'll just carry on doing whatever I was going to do anyway, it's all hopeless. So I want to just end, I had about 10 minutes, with, you know, asking everyone here to reflect, as I did a few years ago. For me, although I've taken part in these negotiations, I've also taken part in the protests organized by Extinction Rebellion, and with my children, I have 4 children, attended many of the climate strikes organized by the young people and students, because it's not just politicians. We can't leave it just to the politicians. We have to act in our own professions. We have to act in our own workplaces. We have to use the power, imagination, creativity, and the tools that we have to reduce emissions. And everyone working in the building, design, construction sector has a huge role to play in literally building the future, in helping us imagine a better future. And I hope that we can all work towards that, and that I will hopefully see some of you at the summit that Ed is talking about in October, which will go ahead, you know, a month ahead of this crucial summit in 2021 in November in Glasgow, and that we will all be working together from today onwards to change the facts on the ground, to change the minds of those who are still resisting and still thinking that they're waiting for someone else to show the leadership that's now needed. So thank you very much, Ed, for giving me this opportunity, and to Architecture 2030 for, you know, holding the 1.5 torch. Things are moving, people are becoming more ambitious, there is a much greater realization, and if we don't do this, then you know, these young children, as I said, I have 4 children under the age of 26, are going to not forgive us and hold us to account for forever. So I encourage you all to step up and to help us keep on the 1.5 pathway. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Farhana. That concludes this session. We will now hear from Harrison Fraker. I'd like to introduce Harrison. He's a close friend and former colleague. We go way, way back. He was the former dean and a professor from the University of California, Berkeley, and he'll moderate this next session. The session is titled Reset Urbanization, Global Sprawl, Climate Change, and Equity, and Peter Calthorpe will will give the presentation.